I'll just show you a sample. Now, we didn't do it this way. This is another version to make it, and to be honest with you, this is actually a little more complicated. Here's another version. So Tom's another instructor. He's teaching a similar class in Programmer Analyst. So this was Tom's version of the to-do app with the mean stack. And you'll notice, so this part looks familiar. We've got roots and views. You know, here's our, he did it to-do.js. So here's our get method that returns the JSON. This will look the same as what we did, but in the public folder, it's split up even more. He's got a subfolder for to-dos, and in here we've got config, controls, and services. So here's his factory. We did this in one file. He's split it up into two separate files. So it can be confusing, but also like anything else, it's new. So when you're seeing it for the first time, it's going to be somewhat unfamiliar. I'm going to put a link up on Blackboard. I basically took most of what we did here, although I simplified it, from this link. A good tutorial on thinkster.io. It was building like a little, so you can't actually watch the videos, but it gives you all the code one piece at a time. And they actually use a little bit of related data as well. So I'll put this link up. This wouldn't be a bad thing to go through on your own if you want more practice with the full stack. It'd be very similar to what we've done in class. So the next thing we want to do is we'll just do one other thing here, is let's just display a number. I'm going to take out the word current here. I'll just display a number beside the tasks. So in my HTML, I'll go to my line 23 where it says current tasks. I'm just going to delete that. How could we display the number of tasks in our task list? You got it. We can use, and we just have to wrap that in our handlebars. We say tasks.length. Because we're calling get tasks up above on the body, it calls that function right away and populates our task list. We should have access to the length of that array. So if we refresh this, that's good. And this number will update in real time as we add or delete because of Angular's two-way data binding. As soon as we click add with a new task and we save it to the database, this number is going to get updated in our task list we're going to want to repopulate. So we just added this little piece and we took out the word current. I don't think we'll get into, we won't have time today for marking tasks as complete and having two different lists for current and complete beyond what we have time to cover. So now I want to deal with our little form here. We have a text box. Now, Adam, you mentioned this much earlier, right? That we would need to bind our text box. So what Angular directive will we add on our input? Yeah, we'll add an ng model directive. And what should the value of this be? Good guess. It's already displayed on our page. Here's our model. Which value of our model do we want to bind to the text box? Yeah, we want that to fill the title. So our ng model will be title. So we're doing two-way binding. And what directive do we need here on our add button to invoke an Angular function? We did it last week with our little HTML task list. Yeah, we need an ng click directive. So instead of the default behavior of a form submission, we're going to call an Angular method. So ng click, and we'll write a function called add task. So that will be a function in our Angular controller, which will then call a function with the same name in our Angular factory, which will do send a post request to the server. If we refresh the form right now, we might, well, I don't think we'll get an error unless we click the button. If we click the button, we'll get an error because it's going to say it doesn't know what add task is. Add task is undefined. So if I add something, actually sorry, I'm surprised. I thought we would get an error, but no error, but nothing happens on that button. So if our button is going to call an add task function in our controller, we now need to write a new function in our controller that we'll call scope.addTask. Which will be a callback function where we pass in a task object. First thing we're going to want to check is that the user didn't leave the title box blank and just click the add button. So we'll check for blank title. We will say if our scope.title is empty, and this comes to the question we talked about at the first break, return. So don't do anything. Basically exit the function if we don't have a title. We're not going to let the user add tasks with no title. If we do have a title, we're going to call our factory and we'll call the add task method. We haven't written this yet. We'll have to write it. And now we'll pass in our title. So, oops. Our scope.title, that just is the value from our text box because our text box is using ng model title. So we'll add in our factory. And after we add, so once we call this function and pass in the title, that should add the new task to our database. Guess I can say that, to add to the DB. And then we'll refresh the data on the page. We don't need to reload the page, which is why Angular is so good. After we've saved the title, we did this last week, we're going to change the scope title back to an empty string. That will clear out our text box. So once we add a task, the name of that task doesn't stay in our text box. And then we'll call get tasks to repopulate our list. So we're going to make sure we have a title. We're going to call the add method in our factory, which will add the record to our database. We still have to write that code. Clear out the text box and repopulate our task list. So the new task should appear at the bottom And our whatever number of tasks we have, that will get added, incremented by 1. If we had 4 tasks, it'll now say 5. And that new task will appear at the bottom of the list. So that's everything we need to do in the controller. So we wrote the code in our EJS. We've written the code in our controller that will get invoked when the user clicks that green add button. So that's step 2. We now need to write the code for this part. That's step 3, is to create an add task method up here. And then step 4 is we'll need a router.post handler in our root file that will actually talk to the model and save to the database. So we have 4 steps in this process. We've done the first 2. Wire up our form with ng-model and ng-click, and write the function that can receive that event. Once we do this, we're going to have to do the same thing with delete. We'll need an ng-click on our delete buttons. We'll need a delete task function in our controller, and we'll need a delete task function in our factory, and then a root handler. So let's go up in our file to our factory, and underneath my get tasks, but above my return, we're going to create a new function called add task this time. We are passing in a task object. So we're going to use the HTTP Angular library again, but instead of executing a GET request, this time we want to execute a POST request. We're submitting data. So this time we're going to do a POST at /tasks. And we need to pass in the task object we want to add. So notice our get has no parameters. We can call get. We don't have to send anything to that function. Get doesn't need any information to run our query. But when we're adding a task, we have to pass in the object we need to add to the database. And we'll do the same, .success. So we're going to call our post, and we also want to add the current task to our task list in memory. So we're going to add it to the array. So we use o.tasks.push. That adds an element to an existing array. We already have an array of tasks. We're going to submit that task to the database with post, and then we're going to update the factory task list as well in memory. So again, starting from the beginning, when we click this button, it calls the controller add task method. Our controller calls our factory. Our factory does an HTTP post. If I run this code right now, if I put in a task and click add, what do you suppose will happen? So if I go and load my form up right now, right, we got a 404 not found because we're trying to run a post method at localhost 3000/tasks. Our root index.js, we have a get handler, we haven't written a post handler. I think, Brandon, I think that's what you said, if I heard you correctly. So all our code is running properly. The button's calling the controller's calling the factory, and the factory's trying to do a post. But our application doesn't know how to do a post yet. We haven't written that code. So here's our function in our factory. So if yours is working properly, you'll get a 404 not found error at this point. If you don't have a 404 not found, well, you could put in a console log here. And you could put in a console log here just to see where your code is going and how far it's getting. So the last step we need now is to write the code that when we get an HTTP post, we need to use our model and save that new task to the database. And that'll have to happen here in index.js. I'll leave this code up for another minute. And then we'll write the post handler. If anybody needs to see the controller, let me know and I can scroll down. You can see the add task in the task controller. So this is what we added. The stuff on line 60, that was already here. Those are the tags that close the controller. We've added up lines 46 to 59. So you can try doing the same thing. You can do console log controller add task and see if it prints so you know whether at least this function's being called. Okay. So make sure you have the ng click on your ng click and you should have the brackets, right? We're calling the add task function in our controller. Were you missing the brackets? Again, here it is in the here's the factory method that calls our root file. So now let's go to our roots index.js. Where we want to add a task. We're going to write a post handler at the same URL. So here we'll do the same thing we've done previously. We'll use our task model. So I'll create a local variable called task which is equal to a new task with a capital T, because that's our model. We can just pass in request.body. So when we're doing our post in our factory, when we do our get, we don't pass anything in, but when we do a post, we pass in the task object from our front end. So we'll just set up a local variable called lowercase task. We'll create a new capital T task. Try to add. We can call task.save. We'll get back either an error or a task object. An error. I'll return next. We'll return the error and stop execution if we got an error. Otherwise, we'll just send back in JSON the task object. So our server-side code now is really light. All it does is send the data to the model. Doesn't interact with the front end at all. We're using Angular to invoke these things on the back end. So this will make the 404 go away. We now have a post handler at this URL. I'm just going to try it and see how it works. So I've got 4 tasks. I need to refresh here. Now when I add, it's added to my list in real time. What appears to be real time, and my task list number is updated. There's no page refresh, there's no lag, it appears instantly. I can probably stop printing out all these console logs. So our server code's very simple. We're just using Mongoose, we call save, we send back JSON. Server end is done.
Well, we have to specify JSON.
You know what? That's a good question. I'm thinking we may not even have to send it back. We already have our task object here. We could probably, I'm going to try it. We could probably not even bother sending anything back. And instead of pushing the data we get back, just push the task that comes in. Is that what you were thinking? We already have it, so why do we need to? Okay. Good point, Adam. I'm going to comment mine out and we'll try that. So nothing, just an empty callback. We don't get anything back. And instead of pushing data, we just push the task that we got in. Okay. And then here, we could probably just call res.end. So just end the response at that point. That might work fine. I haven't tried it like that. Logically, I would think that should give us the same result, but let's see. Yep, works fine. Sure, that's probably more efficient. No need to send back the JSON. We already have the new task. So I'll leave the old code there. I've commented out. I'll push all this to Git, but that's probably better. We don't have to send anything back in this case, really. So that's even better. Is it me or did the air conditioning just come on in here? Okay, just checking. So I'm glad you asked that question, Adam, because that shows you're getting a sense of kind of how the pieces are starting to fit together.
Can you think of a reason why MongoDB couldn't start?
You're still trying to connect to your local MongoDB?
Yeah.
You tried connect, I thought,
Just like, it's, can you think of like a reason why? Because it'll start us off.
try starting it with sudo. Maybe it's a permissions issue. Off the top of my head, I don't know. Can you use MongoLab instead?
I did. It, like when I refresh the page, it shows up in Google.
When you refresh the page, it,
Like when I go back on localhost, if I exit and go back, it shows up and then quickly goes away.
I'll have to look at it. So we now should be able to add, our task list is getting kind of long, but we should be able to add and view our tasks instantly. So our code is nice and modular. For those of you who are doing your presentation on building a REST API, well, we've almost built a REST API here with a get and post, because these just interact with JSON only, right? There's no front-end interface in the root file. So if we wanted to expose these methods and make them available to let some other application called get tasks, well, all they have to do is make a get request to our domain/tasks, and they're going to get back all our data in JSON.
How secure is this? It's like if we were doing like, if we wanted a like an asynchronous login, would this cause a lot of issues with security?
Well, what typically happens, well, it's still secure, because if we wanted to make this method secure, we would secure it just the way we did in class, right? We would add in passport. We would put in a function here that would check if the request is authenticated. And in here, we would call that function so it would only be available to an authenticated user. If we wanted to, or were you thinking in an API terms, how is it secure?
I was thinking more so it's like just transferring like sensitive data between like the across the Angular and the things that it is, if there's any openings for attacks, or is it just not an issue just because of how it works?
It's not an issue because Express and Node compiles your JavaScript on the server side. The individual server-side JS files, they don't get published to the server. It's like ASP.NET, where we have the DLL. It goes in the bin folder, and that's the compiled server-side code. So it's locked, in effect. Right? Every time we run it locally, it recompiles that server-side code. So the Angular front end is there, but the server-side stuff is protected.
Okay.
So I want to do one more function, which is delete. We have these delete buttons that don't do anything. So we want to repeat the same process we just went through with add. We'll need to write an ng-click event and attach it to the delete buttons, an ng-click directive. We'll need to write a delete task function in our controller and a matching delete task function in our factory. And then we'll write a delete handler here. We've only used get and post so far. We haven't actually used delete or put, but we'll use a router.delete here, which is what's typically used rather than a get. So we'll go back. On our delete button, we want to add an ng-click directive. ng-click equals, we'll call our new function delete task. But we also need to specify which task we're deleting. So in this case, we're going to have a parameter in our delete. We're going to pass in the task and the ID value. So I've added what's in blue to my delete button. So if the user clicks it, run an Angular directive in our controller called delete task and pass in the task._ID. So that'll send in the object ID created by MongoDB. That's all we have to do here. We'll save that. We want to write this delete task function in our controller. And the first thing that probably should be in there is a little JavaScript pop-up window. Are you sure you want to delete this? So underneath my add task in my controller, I'm going to add a delete task. So in our scope, we'll write a new function called delete task. Yes, we do. So we need a parameter here for that as well. I know, Scott, we're getting there.
Oh, sorry.
So in here, we're going to pass in an ID parameter. So the first thing we want to do, now we can still write, this is still just a JavaScript file, even though it's using Angular. We can still write vanilla front-end JavaScript. So we have access to do like window.confirm. So we'll say if window.confirm if the user clicks OK to this, and sorry, down here I missed a semicolon. So at the end of scope.delete task, we need a semicolon here where I have line 69. So if the user clicks cancel, nothing will happen. But if the user says yes, then we need to call the delete task method we're going to put into our factory. Tasks. Delete task. And we'll pass in our ID. So just like this function has an ID parameter, our factory delete function will also have an ID parameter. Brandon?
Should the first one be ID or underscore ID?
It doesn't matter. It's just a parameter name here. It will matter in the server end. It'll have to be underscore ID there. So there's our controller task method. So if I save this and click the button, I should get the JavaScript confirmation. And if I click OK, then I'm going to get an error because delete task doesn't exist in our factory yet. So if I go to delete this, I get my JavaScript window. If I click cancel, if I click OK, now we get an error. Tasks.delete task is not a function. That's fine. That's what we should get, because we're calling a function in our factory that we haven't written yet. So this is what you should get if you click OK to the JavaScript confirmation. Tasks is not a function error. Okay, so here again. Line 65 to 71, that's our new controller function. So now we need to write the delete task function in our tasks factory. It's going to be pretty similar to our add function that we just did. So I'm going to go up to my factory. And after my add task, but before my return statement, we'll write an O dot delete task function. So in this case, what we want to do is return an HTTP. We're going to do a delete request instead of a get or post. And we're going to do this at tasks plus our ID. Whoops, sorry, there should be a slash here. Slash tasks slash. So we want to append on the ID to the end of that URL. Let's think about this for just a second. You know what? I think we can change this a little bit. I'm going to pass in our delete task a task, just like we did with add. We'll pass in the object because Adam, I'm thinking about your question. If we pass in the whole task, then we can remove it from the local array. We don't have to get it back from our root file. So we'll pass in a task. And here this will be task and probably task .id. So we're going to delete it from the server, and then we also want to remove this item from our task array. Well, we can either remove it from the array or we can just call get tasks. That's probably faster. So maybe now we'll just call o.get tasks. Just refresh the list. So if it deletes from the server, we're going to try this. We're going to get a 404 error because we haven't written a delete handler. Just want to see if we get any other errors. If we only get 404, we're good. So now if I delete one and say OK, whoops, ID is not defined.
I think it's in the controller. You didn't put task.id.
Right. That should be task.id, I believe. Actually, that'll have to be an underscore ID. May have to tweak it a little bit. Let me try that again. Okay, good. So it's trying to run a delete at this URL. Actually, notice it's not quite right because we've still got undefined.
No, I just had ID as my thing in the controller. It was working fine.
Here, you just had it as ID?
Yeah. Oh, but up top there in the function task, I also had ID being passed through there, not task.
Okay. So back to how it was. That would need to be, well, let's try it and see. Okay, yep, that works. There's our ID. So we set ID, call delete, and we append on our task.id. So now all we need to do is write the delete handler in our index.js, which won't take us long.
So, quick question about the delete handler.
Yep.
Is that pre-written in, or are we able to just make whatever kinds of?
Good question. By default, these are the methods. And what CRUD operation they map to. So post is for creating, get is for reading, put is for updating, patch could also be updating, and delete. So these are actually keywords. So you can't make them up. You can't do like router dot Brandon's verb. Okay, these are built-in HTTP methods. So we've only used post and get, but now we'll use delete. And if we had time to do update, we would use router.put. And these are typical if we're building, again, this is going to help those of you building a REST API. If you're going to build a REST API, those are typically going to be the names of the functions. Okay. So now we need in our index.js. So yes, those are HTTP keywords. We use router.delete. So at tasks slash, and then an ID parameter. Save. We'll create a local variable. We've done this before, request.params.id. We did this in class. And then we just call task.remove. where the underscore ID is equal to our ID. We get back an error or a task. So that'll remove it from the database. If we get an error, we'll return the error. If not, we can just call res.end. We don't have to send anything back. Just remove it from the database and end the response. So if we try this now, if we've done it correctly, it should remove the task from our database. And then we're calling our getTasks method, which will refresh our page. We'll just try it out. I'll put the code back. So now if I delete and say OK, I did delete, it didn't do an auto refresh. So we'll want to change one thing here. Rather than calling the get tasks, I think we need to actually change the tasks array here. So I'm going to delete that. We need to find out where this element is in the array. With o.tasks.indexOf and task.id. It'll tell us where in the array this object is. And then we can remove it with the splice method. And then we'll call o.getTasks. Sorry, we need those two lines. Remove the element from the array. That should do our refresh. Yes, I will put everything on GitHub. I had to go a little bit fast at the end there. I'm just going to try that out one last time. So if I delete my task 6, well, it is deleting. Oh, the problem here is we never called get tasks again. After we run delete here, we need to call scope.getTasks. Missed that. That was the piece that was missing. There. So it does an instant update. Okay, so there's our full mean stack app. I will push all the code to GitHub. I'm also going to put a link to this tutorial, or I should give them credit. Be a good idea if you want something, another thing to try building, you can go ahead and do it. They lay out all the code for you. It's quite well done.